Fred and Rosemary West are among the most notorious criminals in British history. Their crimes shocked the world and left a trail of tragedy and horror that continues to haunt the memories of those who learned about them. This story tells the true and chilling tale of how Fred and Rosemary West committed their heinous acts, how they were eventually caught, and the devastating impact their crimes had on their victims and society. Early lives, the seeds of darkness. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, in a small village called Muchmarcle in Herefordshire, England. His family was poor, and his childhood was marked by neglect and abuse. Fred's father was a strict disciplinarian, and it is said that Fred was sexually abused by his mother, Daisy. These early experiences left deep scars on Fred's psyche, shaping him into the disturbed man he would become. Rosemary Letts, later known as Rosemary West, was born on November 29, 1953, in Northam, Devon. Like Fred, Rosemary came from a troubled background. Her father, Bill Letts, was a paranoid schizophrenic who was abusive towards Rosemary and her siblings. Her mother, Daisy Letts, suffered from severe depression and underwent electroconvulsive therapy while she was pregnant with Rosemary. This treatment may have affected Rosemary's brain development, leading to her erratic and violent behavior later in life. Rosemary was sexually abused by her father from a young age, which left her with a twisted understanding of relationships and sexuality. By the time she was a teenager, Rosemary was already displaying signs of instability, including mood swings and aggressive behavior. The meeting of Fred and Rosemary, a deadly union. Fred and Rosemary's paths crossed in 1969 when Rosemary was just 15 years old, and Fred was 28. They met at a bus stop in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire. Fred was immediately attracted to Rosemary, and despite the age difference, he pursued a relationship with her. Rosemary, who had never experienced a healthy relationship, was drawn to Fred's charm and attention. They quickly became inseparable. Fred's influence over Rosemary was profound. He introduced her to a world of sexual perversion and violence. Rosemary, who had already been traumatized by her father's abuse, found herself in a relationship that reinforced her darkest instincts. Together, they embarked on a life of crime that would eventually lead to the deaths of many innocent people. The first murders, a family affair. Fred West had already committed his first known murder before meeting Rosemary. In 1967, he killed a young woman named Anne McFall, who was pregnant with his child. Anne had been a nanny to Fred's children from a previous marriage, and she had developed a close relationship with him. However, when she became pregnant, Fred saw her as a threat to his lifestyle and killed her. He dismembered her body and buried the remains in a field near his home. This murder set the stage for the gruesome crimes that would follow. After Fred and Rosemary moved in together, they began to target young women who were vulnerable and easy to manipulate. Their first victim as a couple was Charmaine West, Fred's daughter from his first marriage. Rosemary, who was jealous of Charmaine, viewed her as a nuisance. In June 1971, while Fred was in prison for petty theft, Rosemary killed 8-year-old Charmaine. She told Fred that Charmaine had gone to live with her mother, but in reality, Rosemary had murdered the child and buried her body in the basement of their home. When Fred was released from prison, he helped Rosemary cover up the crime. He dismembered Charmaine's body and buried the remains in the garden of their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, where many more victims would eventually be hidden. The murders escalate. 25 Cromwell Street. Fred and Rosemary West got married in 1972, and shortly after, they moved into 25 Cromwell Street, a house that would become the site of unimaginable horror. The couple began to lure young women to their home under various pretenses. Some were runaways, others were hitchhikers, and some were even lodgers at their house. Once inside, the women were subjected to horrific abuse, including sexual assault, torture, and eventually murder. The West's crimes were carefully planned and executed. Fred would often scout for potential victims while driving around the countryside. Once he identified a target, he would convince them to come to 25 Cromwell Street, where Rosemary would take over. Rosemary's role in the murders was just as active as Fred's. She took pleasure in the sexual violence and torture that they inflicted on their victims. One of the most horrifying aspects of the West's crimes was the way they disposed of their victims' bodies. Fred, who had a background in construction, was skilled at digging and burying bodies. He would often dismember the victims, removing their fingers and toes to prevent identification, and then bury the remains in the cellar or garden of 25 Cromwell Street. The couple's cruelty knew no bounds. They even killed their own daughter, Heather West, in 1987. Heather had grown up in the abusive environment of her parents' home and had become increasingly aware of their dark secrets. She confided in friends that she feared for her life, but no one took her seriously. When Heather threatened to leave and expose her parents, Fred and Rosemary decided to silence her. They killed Heather and buried her body under the patio in their garden. The horrors uncovered. The arrest of Fred and Rosemary West. For years, Fred and Rosemary West continued their killing spree without arousing suspicion. The police had little reason to investigate the disappearances of the women, many of whom were already living on the margins of society. However, the couple's reign of terror began to unravel in 1992 when one of their victims, a 16-year-old girl named Caroline Owens, managed to escape. Caroline had been hired by the Wests as a nanny, but she soon became a target of their sadistic fantasies. They bound, gagged, and raped her over the course of several days. Miraculously, Caroline managed to escape and reported the assault to the police. Fred and Rosemary were arrested and charged with indecent assault, but Caroline was too traumatized to testify, so the charges were dropped. Despite this close call, the Wests continued their crimes until 1994, when the police finally began to investigate the disappearance of Heather West. Heather's friends had reported her missing, and when the police questioned Fred and Rosemary, their stories were inconsistent and suspicious. The investigation intensified, and in February 1994, the police obtained a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street. What they found shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The remains of 9 women were discovered buried in the cellar and garden, all of whom had been brutally murdered and dismembered. The police also found evidence of sexual abuse and torture, including restraints, pornography, and homemade videos documenting some of the crimes. Fred West was arrested on February 25, 1994, and Rosemary was arrested shortly afterward. During police interviews, Fred initially took full responsibility for the murders, claiming that Rosemary had no involvement. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Rosemary was an active participant in the killings. Fred confessed to the murders of 12 women, including his first wife, Rena Costello, and his stepdaughter, Charmaine. However, it is believed that the true number of victims could be much higher, as Fred hinted at other murders that he never fully disclosed. The trial and conviction justice for the victims. Fred West never faced trial for his crimes. On January 1, 1995, while awaiting trial in prison, he hanged himself in his cell. In a final act of control, Fred took the secrets of his other possible victims to the grave, leaving many families without closure. Rosemary West, however, did face justice. She was charged with 10 counts of murder and stood trial in October 1995. During the trial, the court heard harrowing evidence of the torture and abuse inflicted on the victims. Rosemary maintained her innocence throughout, claiming that she had no knowledge of the murders and that Fred had acted alone. The jury, however, was unconvinced. On November 22, 1995, Rosemary West was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge described her crimes as evil beyond belief and recommended that she never be released from prison. Rosemary remains in prison to this day, one of the few women in the UK to be given a whole life tariff, meaning she will never be released. She continues to maintain her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. The aftermath, the legacy of Fred and Rosemary West. The crimes of Fred and Rosemary West left a deep and lasting impact on British society. The case highlighted the failure of authorities to protect vulnerable women and children, many of whom were failed by social services and the police. The fact that the Wests were able to commit their crimes for so long without detection raised serious questions about how such atrocities could happen in a supposedly civilized society. The victims of the Wests were not just the women they murdered, but also their surviving children who were subjected to years of abuse and neglect. The West's other children, who had been raised in an environment of unimaginable horror, were taken into care after their parents' arrest. They have since tried to rebuild their lives, but the scars of their childhood will never fully heal. 25 Cromwell Street, the house of horrors where so many lives were taken, was eventually demolished in 1996. The site is now a public walkway, a quiet place that belies the terror that once took place there.